Thank you, James, and thank you all for being here at this Glastonbury of the Mind. I'll be trying to channel Stormzy or Kylie or both in the course of what's remaining of Agatha's trip to the right, or the centre right, whichever is appropriate. And as James said, we are starting today with the future of the party, the Conservatives, which some might say ought to have a question mark at the end, in the midst of a very strange contest which is being covered on television, in hustings, in the newspapers, across social media, to decide the identity of the next Conservative Prime Minister, in which almost none of us will have a vote. As Vladimir Putin says, liberalism is indeed dead. So obviously the question is, why is this happening? What does it portend? And more broadly, what is the future of conservatism, and is the Conservative Party actually the best vehicle for it? Now, I want to kick off straight away. We've got some fantastic people here in the newsroom to address the question. And I want to start by asking Rachel Wolfe.
Oh, I knew you were going to
Yeah, I'm afraid so, yeah. Who, the founding partner of Public First, but also someone who has been in the very heart of policy making. When you look at conservatism now, do you think of it as a vibrant intellectual tradition that's just in need of a bit of reinvigoration, or is it in some sort of structural decline?
So, this is my personal view. I'm not sure that conservatism has ever been like a vibrant intellectual tradition. I think the vibrancy and intellectual drive within the Conservative Party have often come from other elements that are not kind of traditional conservatism. I think there is no question that this is a government that, even though it has been through endless ruptions, is tired and doesn't have, and I don't think any of the leaders have, any of the leadership contenders have a clear direction or vision for where they want to take Britain. Normally what happens is you get chucked out in opposition for a while. You actually have time to think and talk to other people. And that's when ideas really start to emerge. It was always really noticeable to me that the people who did the best and were most radical and most effective in government were always the people who'd had the chance to think about the same subjects in opposition. And the problem is in some sense less that the Conservative Party has no vibrant intellectual sort of drive, but that there is no viable alternative that isn't horrendous, that might allow itself to reinvent itself for a while. That seems to me the sort of bigger challenge in many ways, because of course governments get tired and need to go out and rethink and come back. That's a sort of natural cycle that is stymied at the moment because Corbyn would be even worse.
Which is a pretty dry and desiccated reason to vote Conservative.
It is, but honestly, like probably enough of one. I mean, you know, it is a dry and desiccated reason, but
doesn't quicken the pulse, does it?
It doesn't quicken the pulse, but avoiding catastrophe is the most conservative of all conservative things to do, right? So
very elegantly done. Could we have the first slide, which shows in grisly detail what Conservative Party members who are going to be voting for their next leader and therefore our Prime Minister believe? As you'll see.
Do you have a comparison of that against the population?
We don't, I think, on hand, but I don't know if anyone can rustle up some figures quickly, but I feel fairly sure it's not hugely representative. And certainly it gives you a picture of where they're coming from and perhaps explains the polls of who they're backing. Amol Rajan, you've been an editor of a newspaper, you are media editor of the BBC and a practice presenter and a
Practice presenter.
Yeah, no.
What does that mean?
It means that you're very good, Amol. And I'm not going to go.
You need a bit more practice.
Yeah.
More practice.
Yeah,
Serious, mate. You're bloody practice chair.
I'm looking at Agatha, and I'm not going to go any further down this route. You be quiet. Now, what I was going to ask you before that unnecessary detour was what you, as an observer of all this, of some while, think about where the Conservative Party is at, just as a political force.
So let me just start by saying, for all the reporters from Mail Online who are here in this room, that everything I'm about to say is completely impartial. So I'd say this is having never been a member of any political party, but having been a political obsessive for a long time. I think the thing that Rachel sort of is implying, which is the key thing, is there's a huge difference between conservatism and the Conservative Party. And conservatism is an intellectual force which is pretty, I mean, the instinct behind it might be modern, but it was really sort of forged in response to the French Revolution by a Whig, by Edmund Burke. It's a sort of sentiment. It's not a written down constitutional practice. It's a disposition or an attitude. And as long as there are human beings, I think there'll be conservatism. And then there's the Conservative Party, which is in a very different place. And I think that the difficulty the Conservative Party has is the same that other parties have, which is that they are a response to a society which doesn't exist anymore. The Conservative Party and Labour came out of an industrial society which is stratified by class, and it was a response to economic circumstances. And since they were founded, since even the Labour Party was founded just over a century ago, since it got into parliamentary representation, a lot has happened. And I would point to 4 enormous changes which have changed the nature of our politics and which I think the main parties are struggling to grapple with. One is mass demographic change. This is a very, very, very different country. It's much more diverse. The sort of people who make up this country are very, very, very different to the sort of people that made up this country a century ago. That's great for me. I came to this country when I was 3 in 1986. I've been a beneficiary of demographic upheaval, what some people call mass immigration. Second massive change, which is, I think, the most neglected force in our politics, and not nearly enough attention is given to it, is mass education. In the 1960s, I think about 200,000 people went to university. It's now closer to about 2 million. I know Tortoise has looked at the fact that the key dividing line in our politics, true of Trump, true of Brexit, is between graduates and non-graduates. And there has been a capture of politics in this country and elsewhere by the graduate class. If you look at the number of non-graduates in politics, in Parliament, it's very, very, very low. If you look at the surest predictor of whether or not people would vote for Brexit, it was that they weren't people that went to university. That's not because if you vote for Brexit, you're stupid. It's because if you go to university, it gives you certain things that make you more likely to vote Remain. It gives you a sense of confidence about dealing with a modern economy, gives you a sense of mobility, it perhaps gives you connections to thrive in big cities. The third big change is ageing. We are a really, really old society. And the key point about your stats up there, Matt, and the work you've done in preparation for this, is that the people who are deciding the next Prime Minister are old. And this is an old country
Could we have
getting
the
very,
second
very...
slide up, actually, just to illustrate them all?
Getting a hell of a lot
Who they
older.
are.
And the rate at which, we live in a time, and I know Tortoise spends a lot of time thinking about this, it's appropriately slow, isn't it? Oh, no, it's up there. I thought it would take ages to come up. We are experiencing this... this extraordinary shift, the central kind of fact of our times is Easternization. We live in an Asian century. For 500 years, the locus of global history has been in the war between European states and then empires. Power is shifting to the East. Why is that happening? It's because the East is young. The West is an old idea now, and it's run by old people. And the next, likely, Boris Johnson will be younger than Corbyn or Trump, but basically the West is old, and we need to grapple with an ageing society, which is what that is about. And then the fourth big change is technology, and technology is basically part of this sense that things are speeding up. We live through this great acceleration, and people have lost this sort of sense of control. So I see thousands of columns, Matt, I'm sure some of them commissioned by people in this room, about how we've gone from issues of economics to issues of belonging, politics of identity. I don't see that many attempts to explain why that's happened. And I think if we have gone from a sort of socio-economic to a socio-cultural politics, I think those 4 factors are part of the explanation of why. And the direct answer to your question is the Conservative Party will thrive to the extent that it's able to reposition itself as an answer to those 4 questions. We do not live, I think, in a Labour Conservative country as we did a century ago. We live in 2 countries, Romania and Leaveland. Yeah. And that is a fundamental problem for a party, any party that wants to represent all people.
Thank you. Andrew, you were, amongst your other many distinctions, you were chair of the Conservative Party and had to grapple with this.
Yeah.
Where do you think the Conservative Party is now in this, and where can it go?
Well, I sort of think that the conversation, the way the conversation is framed sort of contains some misconceptions. So the first is that it's ever been the case that members of a political party are the mainstream. It's never been a mainstream sport. It's always been, being a member of a political party, particularly being an activist, has always been a marginal activity for people who are wonks, who are interested, it used to have a social dimension, that if you lived in the countryside, you'd be a member of a Tory association because you'd be quite likely to meet a wife there. But that's definitely, there were other ways of doing that now. But I think it's now become, it's always been for wonks and nerds. The people that attend party conference are just into politics, so they're not in that sense. It's never been any different. The second misconception that I think this conversation contains is the idea that the views that you set out, the opinions you set out, are actually particularly marginal. I mean, the country voted, a majority of the country, for whatever reason, and I vote to remain, but I mean, there are plenty of conspiracy theories, but essentially a very large number of people, half the population, voted to leave the EU. And you can't get away from that fact in an attempt to sort of... And there were good reasons for that. Amal's articulated many of them, but there were, a sense of anxiety about the future, a sense of not being... globalisation wasn't working for people, concerns about, changes in demographics. All these things fed into it, but it's a fact. It's a mainstream concern, and you only have to look at, the emergence, to the delight of the liberal media in London, of Trig or TIG or whatever they're called, and their very rapid disappearance. Compare and contrast, Nigel Farage in 6 weeks sets up a new party which gets 31% of the vote in the national election. That tells you where the zeitgeist is, and it's not, with the rootless urban elite of which we're all card-carrying members. So you have to respect that. And I think the third misconception is that this group of people, members of political parties, whether Conservative or Labour, are not capable of transcending their own experience of the world and seeing the bigger picture. And the reason I say that is it usually takes sort of a series of catastrophic defeats in elections before they get it. But I mean, the Labour Party, humiliated 4 times by the Conservatives, eventually picked Tony Blair. It wasn't a comfortable thing for them to do. They never really liked him. They boo him now at conference, but they understood at that point that something needed to change, and to secure victory they needed to do that. The Conservative Party, likewise, having attested to destruction the theory that moving to the right was the way to win general elections, eventually held their nose, and 2/3 of Conservative members backed David Cameron in 2005 to be leader. I mean, he wasn't one of them in any sense. David Davis was much more naturally where they felt comfortable, but they sort of thought, well, actually, we need to sort of change our position. So I think that the sort of conversation is framed in a slightly misleading way, and I think that it's sort of a bit more nuanced than that. On the question of where the party goes next, I think that the party will, in its own terms, make a rational choice between the candidates that are on offer. Yes, and I tell you why. Is because the party was sort of presented with Theresa May as leader. And the sentiment of the party in 2016 after the referendum was Boris won the referendum. Let's be clear. Without Boris joining the Leave campaign, Leave would not have won. He was the first mainstream politician to join the Leave campaign. He was hugely powerful and influential in the way that he campaigned. The guy can stand and hold a fish in Hull at 4 a.m, and he's the front page of every newspaper. I mean, he's astonishing campaigning capability. He just saw him holding a dog the other day, and he was the front page. I mean, he only has to hold a live, a living creature, or maybe not a living creature. And
live stream, Lord Film.
Yeah, but he. No, he's a remarkable campaigner. So the point is, the Conservative membership, if given the choice in 2016, would have had him, because they'd have said, well, this is the guy that won it. And go on, you go and sort it out. You've told us it's all going to be all right. Go sort it out. He wasn't given that opportunity. Theresa May has tried her way of doing things, which was from a sort of a Remain perspective. And now they'll say, well, that hasn't worked. Parliament can't agree on a deal. You can't get your deal through. We're in an impasse. So we ought to go back to the guy who told us it was all going to be milk and honey and the promised land, and see what he can do.
What, so science having failed, bring in Dumbledore?
Well, I think bring in. I mean, what you've had up until now is poker basically played by the British government with an entirely open hand. You're playing poker. We're going to leave. No, we're not really. Don't worry. But we're going to leave. We're ready to leave without a deal, and laying the cards on the table. And now you're going to have poker played with a closed hand. You're going to have poker where the civil servants probably who've been engaged in this process aren't going to be engaged in the process anymore, and you're going to have someone who's going to drive the bus headlong towards the cliff and say, we're ready to leave unless you give us a better deal. And that's poker. I mean, that's the game. It's a different game.
Yes.
And it's a sort of scary game, but it's it's a different approach to the negotiation, which is probably required in some ways to break the deadlock. But it will be very bumpy and frightening between now and the end of October.
What could possibly go wrong? So questions, no, not questions, so terrible, schoolboy error there. Scroll back. Please, join in. This is that moment in the day when...
Okay.
Yes.
So my good friend...
Can you just say who you are?
Yeah, I'm Alex Coley. I'm an independent politician. I'm a technology guy. I have lots of different hats. Charity trustee. My friend, good friend Ed Blackwood, who was a media officer at a flagship Conservative London council, likes to say that Parliament is run by just a third of its MPs. A third are too callow, too inexperienced. A third are probably past it, dribbling into their ales in the members' bar. And the question for me really is, when the EU referendum result happened, I remember thinking, a few hours of reflection, it's no big deal. The government makes really good fudge. This is going to get drawn out and it will probably end in nothing. But looking at Boris Johnson, I do wonder, is there such a thing as too much fudge? So the question I have is, what's the right balance of fudge in the Conservative Party?
That's a rhetorical question.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Martin Fletcher. I'd like to take issue with this idea that Boris Johnson is still a Heineken candidate. Let's look at his record. 2008, he won the mayorship of London against an increasingly unpopular incumbent. He inherited a city that was dynamic and growing and into which Cameron and Osborne were pumping money because of the forthcoming Olympics. He then had the Olympics, which were a gift for any incumbent politician. But since then, he's had to take the first really divisive, hard decision of his political career, which was the campaign for Leave instead of Remain. And that's alienated huge numbers of supporters, especially in London, which was his bastion. So where are the polls that show that actually, the Tory party are right to suppose that he can restore their fortunes, that he is still immensely popular in the country? I don't see those polls. And if he's so good at campaigning, why are his handlers keeping him under such tight control now?
I think it was Lyndon Johnson that he said the key is always asking the right questions. And Thatcher asked the questions, what do I do about inflation? What do I do about the unions? What do I do about Britain's position in the Cold War? And I guess Cameron asked, how do I make the Conservative Party palatable? It's not clear to me that other than Brexit, the prospective leaders are asking any questions. Do people have any feelings on what those questions should be in the 21st century? Yes.
Stephen, I'm a worried voter.
You're in a safe space here. Yes.
You're a voter.
You said earlier that the country was splitting into Remain land and non-Remain land, and Brexit land. And perhaps you should consider the reasons behind that and try and solve that. It's this question of the quote, the liberal elite and all those modern interesting ideas, and the fact that that's not been great for the non-graduates collectively. So I think unless the parties come up with an idea about how to change that, they're never going to solve the split in the country, and therefore they're never going to get a consensus party in the middle. The Conservatives under Thatcher, the Labour Party under Blair, had a consensus in the centre of the electorate. I just can't see how we can ever get back to that. I can't see it back to it.
Because it's interesting, Conservatives still seem to be defaulting to the aspiration, low tax, pro-business, in inverted commas, agenda, whatever they're asked. I just wonder whether people think that actually more people are more concerned about security now. Yes?
Surely one of the biggest...
Sorry, can you say who?
Sorry, I'm Charlotte.
Hi, Charlotte.
Just a voter. I would argue one of the biggest swings that you were seeing in population and also within the the movement within the Labour Party, certainly in the populism in the Labour Party, is the increased move away from young voters who are able to buy and private rental sector, and the increased move on private rental sector, which the Conservatives simply don't have an answer for, or a strong, coherent, headline-grabbing answer for, that Labour do. Whether they can back it up is a different story, but they do certainly have that. And that move, when you look at the age of the Conservative Party, which is growing, and home ownership typically, and you look at a younger generation for whom that is entirely not even aspirational, it's just not hopeful, and it is a very different point. I think they have to put almost Brexit to one side and actually start looking at genuine domestic policies that affect people. That has to be a way forward.
And would you put home ownership as the
I'd say home ownership for anyone under 45, which is probably your starting age for home ownership nowadays, seems to be a massive, unachievable, unaspirational thing that is hugely. Stability is fundamental to people, and if you don't have stability in private rental, then that's a huge.
So you've actually got a massive generational divide there.
Yeah,
those who benefited from the property boom in the past and don't anymore.
Yeah, and it's aspiration versus hope, really, isn't it?
Yes.
Leslie Smith.
Hi, Leslie.
Also worried better. I sort of disagree with what Andrew said ages ago, which was that TIG had sort of pitched up and sort of burnt out in sort of 25 seconds. I agree with that bit. But that then Farage shows up and kind of clicks his fingers and he's got a mass movement in 20 seconds. And I think that's kind of the difference between a party and a pressure group. So it's kind of easy to form a pressure group if you've got a charismatic leader and a charismatic message. And Boris's difficulty is Boris is a charismatic leader with a charismatic message. He is a Nigel Farage rather than a party leader. And I was struck, I worked for the Labour Party under Blair and then went to real life in the 90s. And I went to my first Tory conference, which I think was Haig's first conference in Blackpool, which were, with Tim Allen of all people, who'd also worked for the Labour Party. And we were both stunned and amused by this hilarious event where there was a bunch of people on the platform and a sort of attempt at modernisation, and he had, I think he had Margaret Thatcher and Edward Heath in chairs on the platform, hating each other, those IKEA chairs. Yeah, right. And if you stood in a certain place, you could make, they had the big words hanging down from the ceiling, you could make integrity be invisible, which I shared with the photographers there. I mean, it was just the whole thing as well. And then Redwood was on, and they played the music from Twin Peaks. And it was like, everything about it was funny. It was fantastic. It was really, it was such a wonderful event because it was like absolutely mad. But the sort of weird thing is, you had the people on the platform were a political party, but this vast organisation of ladies in twin sets and pearls and blue rinses having a fabulous time meeting famous people, and that's also a party. And I think, finally, I think Boris might revive that, because I think, they'll have a celeb, they'll have a famous person, you've got that thing. And I think the difference in political parties now is that, do you want there to be, what Rachel was talking about, an intellectual hub and people with policy ideas, and that's always gone on completely distinctly from it's great to have a big infrastructure of people who deliver leaflets once a year and show up at fundraisers, and you need that thing. And what TIG didn't have, or Change UK, whatever they're called, is any of that. They had not the slightest clue how to invent a political party. All they had a clue to do is how to do photo ops and have a pressure group, and it was a not even very successful pressure group. And I think for the Conservatives, it is possible that Boris can marry those two things. If you can get the old ladies in the bake sales and the young farmers back on board because they've got a famous person who does the chicken round, he might build the space if he's willing to delegate to have people that will help.
I think he's willing to delegate.
Yeah.
Yes.
My name's Chris Sterling. I live in just outside Bristol. I don't know if that makes me urban elite or not, but
it does.
Yeah.
So I live in Somerset, actually. So I'm talking about, just going back to ideas. I think Margaret Thatcher was one of the first politicians who actually understood climate change. And I mean, I wonder if we ever get beyond where we are now, that the biggest political question in the next 30 years is now we've committed to a zero carbon economy by 2050, how the hell are we going to do it? And whichever party can actually figure that out is perhaps the one that can build some kind of new coalition, because clearly there are going to be lots of trade-offs and difficult coalitions that need to be formed in order to do that. And I sort of wonder, my grandfather was a farmer in Rutland, deeply conservative. My old house that he owned is now where Alan Duncan lives. So I kind of have a sense of that there's a kind of rural conservatism that could be aligned with environmentalism. People who do care deeply about the countryside, about kind of cleaning things up, about the kind of mess we're making, about the lack of what we're doing to nature.
And
if that could kind of come together, I mean, I'm not a conservative, but you could kind of see that. I'm not seeing the Labour Party particularly.
But that's such an interesting point, and it conflicts with but it does involve a change of positioning on the classic conservative battle against regulation, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's going back to maybe Rachel's point about how ideological fundamentally the Conservative Party is. It has, in a sense, imported ideas in the past and is kind of neoliberalism or free market. Is that fundamental to conservatism, or can it ditch it when maybe we need to move beyond that?
Yes.
Anne Spackman, I run a charity called Career Ready. I used to work with lots of people in this room. When you mentioned the sort of disconnect between people talking about taxes and what's actually going on in the country, I have felt almost as if I'm living in a sort of bipolar world where the announcement about taxes completely took me by surprise. I thought, is this what you think is going to really...
You mean Boris Johnson's...
Well, actually, both of them have been talking about taxes, and I thought, is this just an assumption that and they know their audience of voters in the party better than I do? Is this an assumption that is still what rings their bell? Whereas actually out there in the country, I spend a lot of my time in Leave Land. We work in places like Basildon and Thurrock and Ipswich and Grimsby, and you meet plenty of people there who are also potential Conservative voters. This is not as we're not as divided and crass in those ways that people present. But actually, the things they're worried about are increased crime and lack of police officers. Even if technology is the answer, that's the things that people articulate. They're worried about the fact that even quite good schools don't really seem to have quite enough money to do things they think they might be needing to do, and that their county council seems to be collapsing around them, and that there are institutions that no longer really seem to hold up civic society in the way they once did. And that's a very conservative notion. And I do wonder whether or not I think it would have been very interesting to see how Rory Stewart would have played out, because Rory Stewart is a fascinating person. That doesn't mean he would have been a great Prime Minister, but he is a fascinating person. And he actually was much nearer, had a much sort of better touchstone on, I think, actually the things that people genuinely are talking about, irrespective, really, of the way that they would traditionally have voted. And given traditional voting patterns are, in any case, corroding, I think there is a cross-appeal that is not just about whether you're old or whether you're young, about actually looking at the things that impact on people's lives. And there's a sense in which Tortoise is trying to get right into those things. I think you are talking often about those things, but politicians, it may be that they're right and they're more likely to be right, but taxation, I don't hear people talking about taxes.
So my first thought is actually about Martin. My first thought is about the point about Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party. My challenge would be whether they'd have had the success in 6 weeks if anyone other than Nigel Farage had started that party. But my main point on the essay question is what is the future for the Conservative Party? And for me, it will survive, but it'll be about the size of that party. So the big question for whoever becomes Prime Minister, most likely Mr Johnson, is do you move towards the Brexit Party and hemorrhage votes to the Lib Dems and therefore seats, or do you move towards the Lib Dems and lose those votes to the Brexit Party? So the big question for that Prime Minister is, what do we want? Do we want to win Mansfield or do we want to win Cheltenham? That's the question they've got to answer. And we haven't discussed Brexit much, but that is the only question at the moment.
Yes, so it seems to me that a lot of this discussion...
Could you say...
Sorry, Anatole, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and it seems like a lot of the discussion thus far has been talking about policies, about economics. I feel like there's still a tradition of this sort of Clintonite view of, is the economy stupid, is still the sort of, the sort of going phrase of, how politics runs today. And I rather wonder whether there's fundamentally an issue of national identity and sort of a crisis of national identity at play. I remember on the day of the Brexit vote, one of my colleagues here in London said that, he obviously voting Remain and I voted Remain, but he said that, he first and foremost thought he was a Londoner, secondly a European, and, he was distantly only thought himself English or British. And he was, white, and, his parents had grown, were from England. And I think, if you go to rural areas, there's a completely different view of national identity. And there seems to be a sort of a real crisis where actually there's a split between the sort of a metropolitan elite, which doesn't really think the national question, the question of identity, is really a question worth discussing. It's almost, it's pandering to the politics of Trumpian sort of, identity politics. But actually, it is a fundamental question, like, what is our country? What do we stand for? And I think that must be the sort of core question going after the EU. That has to be the question that has to be dealt with, and nobody seems to be dealing with it.
My name's Judith, and I joined the Conservative Party to meet boys way back in the...
Which is a perfectly legitimate...
It went out well at the time. It was great. And then I gave it all up. I lower the tone, and wherever I would go, I couldn't agree more on the climate change side of things. I spend a lot of my working time dealing with renewable energy. But it's the mention of Rory Stewart that I'm just going to talk about for a minute or two. I found myself absolutely fascinated by him and the whole approach of listening. And when I heard that he was having a rally on the evening of the day that he was not pushed through, I found myself catching a train, rushing to the South Bank, and standing there as if I was at a pop concert. It was really strange. But around me, all of us were having these sort of conversations about what are we doing here? What's the appeal? And there was a woman standing in front of me who suddenly turned round and said, "Are you all fed up with what's going on in politics?" And we said, "Yes." And she said, "What you must do, and it doesn't matter which party it is, join the association. You can only change it from inside. Putting an X on a ballot paper once every however many years we vote for all the various levels doesn't do it. Okay, it's a step in the right direction. But what you've got to do is join and become active and do something about it." And I found myself, to my amazement, trying to work out how many years it would be apart, well, far too long to even count, but actually rushing back and going online and joining the Conservative Party to affect it from inside. God only knows what I'm going to do. But I do think that the whole listening approach has to be this thing, rather than both of these candidates are offering us their views that seem to be entrenched in aspic from way back. End of it.
I think, can I just make one comment about the party, which is really interesting, is that if you take Brexit to one side, there is remarkable consensus in the Conservative Party. The Labour Party disagrees quite fundamentally about a lot of things at the moment. There's a sort of real rift between the Watsonian wing of the party and the Corbyn. The Tory Party, apart from some very, very small number of people on the sort of real right who are kind of in that libertarian sort of wonderland, most people in the Conservative Party, there's a sort of liberal conservatism, the sort of Cameroon, which is, socially liberal, fiscally prudent, very concerned about the environment. That there is a sort of real consensus. They don't disagree about much. And if you sort of put Brexit to one side, what's quite surprising is how far that consensus has moved. And if you sort of think about the debate over the last 3 years, at the margins of tax policy, you could say, well, should there be a tax break in there? But on the sort of agenda which Cameron and Osborne set from 2010 onwards, which is we do care about the environment, and we are trying to address social issues, and we do think that it's not just about the economy, stupid. There has been, there isn't that much disagreement, and so I think in a weird way, and I'm not saying it's all sort of sunlit uplands, but in a sense, if you can overcome the Brexit problem, there's actually, if you don't overcome it, it will rip the Conservative Party apart. If you do overcome it, there's actually quite a big opportunity for voices like Rory Stewart's, who is, I agree with you, a very interesting voice, and there were other interesting voices who didn't make it through to the last two, to come through. But they're sort of stuck behind the logjam of this single question at the moment. And so if what you're talking about is this single question and getting it out of the way, you do end up with sort of going towards Boris.
I mean, isn't there a consensus in the Conservative Party if we leave, we've got to do a trade deal with the US? And how's that going to be compatible with environmental?
Well, I don't think there is a consensus that that's the perfect thing to do.
There's lots of things you disagree about post-Brexit.
Well, but I think that well, we don't want to get into a sort of argument, but I mean, I think what I think. I mean, I don't know about the format, Chairman. If I'm allowed to answer questions, that's what I mean.
Civilly brutal.
No. I don't mean that. I mean, it's not supposed to be asking questions and all that. But I mean, look, I think that on the question of a trade deal with the US, so one of the reasons that I voted Remain is that I don't think that there is a vast nirvana opportunity to run around the world and do amazing trade deals. I think we've got a pretty good set of trade deals, and people forget when they talk about this sort of wonderful past where we were buccaneering traders around the world. They forget that we have the largest navy in the world. So if people stop buying our stuff, we send the gunboats in. So it's a different world we're in, and therefore and when people talk about the deal with the US, actually, it's not clear that people would be willing to allow the United States access to the NHS, or that we'd be willing to import chlorinated chicken or genetically modified food. It's not clear at all, and there's no consensus in the Tory party about that. And in fact, on something like, I think on something like the NHS, the single most important defining characteristic of modern compassionate conservatism was that Cameron credibly said, I care about the NHS, I'm going to continue spending money on it, I experienced it personally, it's safe in my hands. He was the first Conservative leader who was able to say that, and that was the defining thing about Cameron conservatism, actually, the defining thing that made it modern. Forget everything else, that was the thing, because of his experience with his son and what he'd gone through, and people sort of said, actually, and in 2010 a lot of nurses and doctors voted for us, they said, actually, you're not going to privatise it. And I think, therefore, it's almost impossible to see a Conservative Party that would allow Trump to come and swamp the NHS in the way that he quite likes.
James.
I was just going to say, Andrew, I think that, and I wanted to pick up on a point that Judith made, but actually, the more I look at what's happening in the Conservative Party, I think that your view of where the heart of the Conservative Party is, I just don't agree. I think that what's happening now is that it started off with a question, which is how does the Conservative Party embrace leave? How does it become the party of leave? But more and more, when you piece it together, it looks like a Bannonite party, right? And I don't mean that in a cultural way, I mean that much more coherently, in that actually what you're beginning to see is a party that says, we want the 17 million, we are going to be the party of lower taxation. With that, we are happy to be the party of the smaller state. And also, when we have been, in the last 10, 20 years, the party of big business, we're actually going to position ourselves as the party of enterprise, of small business. And Boris Johnson's fuck business, if he'd actually said fuck big business, actually that would have been quite in keeping with the message.
He was talking about CBR.
Exactly, and so, but if you think about that, that is very different from the Cameron-Osborne proposition. The Cameron-Osborne proposition was, we are going to be the responsible stewards of the economy, right? We are essentially multilateralists. We want to, ironically enough, put Europe behind us. We believe in the safety net. That's what the NHS statement that Cameron had. And so I think the centre of gravity on the party, ideologically, has moved in a very fundamental way. And the position you paint of, if you put leave aside, the consensus still remains around the Cameron-Osborne position. I just don't think that's true. I think it's fundamentally moving. And the thing that's actually, I think, quite significant about that is that might be quite a successful political strategy. It may not be the future of, you know, the demographics that I'm always talking about, but it could well be the future of enough people to vote. You could get enough across the line. With that in mind, I just want to pick up on Judith's point. I think we should be much more interested in the mechanics of parties. And I know you said right at the beginning, Andrew, that it's not a mainstream sport. I know people have described Conservative Party members in a whole host of ways. But the question I've got is...
children. Those are your very words.
But my point is, parties these days are actually designed for the people at the extremes, and they're designed for capture. And the thing that I think that's really interesting now is if we sat around in this room and just gave ourselves a day to try and work out how organisationally and financially we could take over a party, I think we could probably do that by the turn of the year.
Can I just touch that for a second though, because we're in a slightly unusual point in terms of the power of the membership, and I'm probably one of the few people in this room who are active in a Conservative association. Members have zero power and zero influence on anything except when they are voting for a leader, who then usually then ignores them on absolutely anything they might want for the succeeding thing. That I agree, that is I completely agree. The idea that the membership of the Conservative Party is usually this enormous force on policy making or what a Prime Minister does, I think is simply not true.
But what about Nick Bowles and Dominic Grieve and the entryism in the party? That's had an impact, hasn't it?
These elections, I think.
It's not, there's no evidence of entryism. I mean, if you really want to get into it, the reason the Conservative Party membership was bumping around about 125,000 for years, through the whole Cameron period. And one of the problems was that there was no central management of membership. Every association renewed the membership, and they very rarely sent out renewal letters. So what would happen is every year, it's like a bucket with a hole in it. You'd lose about 15% of the membership, and you'd gain another 15%, roughly. What they've done now is they've moved one of the proposals of the previous chairman, brilliant proposal, was central administration of membership. It's pretty obvious. And they've just put that in place about a year and a half ago. And what that means is that you get automatic renewals online and you're asked to renew. And people, funnily enough, when you ask them, they do renew. And so therefore the membership has gone up from 125 to 172,000. And that is mainly driven by the fact that you've taken the hole out of the bucket. There's very little evidence.
Well, hang on a minute. In Beaconsfield, there was a surge of new members shortly before Dominic Grieve lost a no confidence vote.
I think Dominic Grieve, if you look at the overall pattern of membership, there is no evidence for it. Is it possible that in an individual situation like Dominic Grieve, who's a particularly outspoken advocate of a particular position, that some people might have joined? I suppose that's conceivable, although under the rules, there is a 3-month, that's on a leadership election, for example, you have to have been a member for 3 months before you can vote in a leadership election. So there's no entryism there's very little entryism in respect of this election.
Can I come back to one thing quickly?
Yes, sure, yeah.
Which is just this question of whether the Conservative Party is adapted. Because I think you're right, there is a new coalition that the Conservative Party is approaching. But I think underlying sort of Andrew's point is that there are a few things which were dramatically holding the Conservative Party back, many of which were social: opposition to gay marriage, support for the NHS, which put them at odds, actually increasingly, with the population as a whole. And I think one of the strengths of the Conservative Party has always been it is fundamentally pragmatic and would quite like to be in power, please. And it is therefore inherently adaptable as a membership. You know, one of the things I got advice on, because I'm on the candidate list and I've done it seriously, but one of the things I got advice on always was when you are asked the question in a selection meeting by an association, would you rebel against your party if it was in the interests of the constituency? The answer should not always be yes, because actually they want to know that you are going to support a governing party. And sort of going back to one of the, I think, the original points, the Conservative Party inherently is a party of power, and it wants to adapt so it can form a stable coalition. Those coalitions are shifting, and therefore the Conservative Party is shifting. But I think it is just completely not true that the Conservative Party will, in even the medium term, pursue insane self-harming positions. It's just not its nature.
My name is Sigrun Aristotle. I'm an Icelandic journalist, but Londoner through and through, because I've been living in London for almost 20 years. I found it interesting to see the characteristics of Conservative members, because the feeling was, having obviously just heard Vladimir Putin saying that liberalism is dead, I was just wondering how many of these members of the Conservatives wouldn't sort of applaud to that. because if
They'd
you
be
look,
horrified.
They'd be horrified.
well,
They'd be horrified by Vladimir Putin. Absolutely.
yes,
I can tell you, horrified.
him as a person, but this
And
idea.
no, it's not the DNA of the party.
Okay.
To that sentiment that you
But
described.
I mean,
I've never seen
voting,
any
sort of
evidence
being in favour of the death sentence.
So a lot of the country.
The whole country. Hold the whole country.
Okay.
This is great.
Over 50% in favour.
I was just sort of thinking if this characteristic of the party sort of shows the tension within the party and sort of makes it clear why the Conservative Party has this problem with Brexit, that you have this core of the party who is going to vote for the leader, who is going to be the decisive factor there, and then you have the, happily and, thankfully, there is this liberal part, which seems to be struggling with the members of the party.
Okay, Amol, you wanted to come in.
One point and then two sort of minor heresies. Just on your point, sir, about the Green movement, there is an obvious semantic link between conservation and conservatism. Conservation is a project of, and conservatism is just an exercise in social ecology, basically. And conservation is a task of husbanding resources, mostly of land. Conservatism is best understood as a task of husbanding resources of love, basically. And the prize for conservatives in green politics is young people. That's the thing, it makes enormous cephalological sense, which is, I think, why, under Andrew's sage advice, David Cameron turned the logo into a little squiggle. So I think the embracing conservatism... squiggle tree.
It's a squiggly tree.
A green squiggly tree. So I think
we hugged some huskies.
We hugged some
squiggly huskies. Did all that stuff.
All that stuff. So I think aggressive. It was all to come instinctively. Green politics ought to come instinctively, and also there's a huge potential prize. And on your point about Basildon and Thurrock, and this is sort of the heresy, I think it's the most deeply rooted superstition of our time that in democracies, all social and economic problems have political solutions. And actually, the really terrifying thing is that there are some places in this country where things are really bad, and politics is going to be limited in its ability to solve them. I think effective, competent, brilliant councils in Basildon and Thurrock, which deliver good local services, reduce crime, because they've got brilliant people in city councils and police, is eminently doable. But I think there are parts, frankly, of coastal Britain where the decline is so precipitous and so awful that it's not obvious what the solution is. And I know this is a heretical thought, because there are people that live in those places who will think, fuck you, London, you've shafted us, and now you're saying there's no solution. The fact is, if you look very hard at the nature of modern economies, they basically benefit from the clustering effect or networks. So power is going into cities where people can come together in small places and come up with ideas and hoard capital. If you live in coastal Britain, in parts of Blackpool, North East, Great Yarmouth, these are people who've seen an extraordinary loss in very, very, very short space of time of certain industries, of a sense of dignity, of peace and stability. And I don't think any Democrat in the West has so far, any centrist Democrat has so far come up with a good solution for those people. There's a popular solution, which is to say to these people, create a narrative, which is that you've been destroyed by this elite that's ignored you. Lots of other people have come in and taken your jobs, and therefore you should vote for us. And the point is that the populist story, which is compelling but doesn't have very good solutions, because it doesn't need to have solutions, because it's generally not had power, is more persuasive than anything that Democrats in the centre have come up with. So I think there's a heretical thought, which is that actually there are some places which aren't voting for centrist liberal people, and I'm not sure those centrist liberal people have good answers for those places. And I think the future of the Conservative Party, to a large extent, exists on whether or not it tries to answer those questions and can do so persuasively. And then the final heresy is, Andrew, 6 years ago, this is the moment to do it. This is the moment. And to make explicit what James has made implicit, which is that there is a quote attributed to you about swivel-eyed loons, which you forcefully denied, which therefore I don't have any reason to believe you said it. But can you just, 6 years on now, in this safe and loving environment, can you explain, you might want to say now that you did say it, but if you didn't, where did that quote come from, and why? What can you just give us a sense of why it was attributed to a Conservative Party chairman?
Leading question.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a leading question.
I didn't say that. It's also
did someone else say it? Did someone else say it?
I don't know. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. Look, the thing about.
No.
The thing about. Well, no. I think what I was going to say to you is the thing about my. I mean, I served the party for 11 years. I organised sort of 10 conferences, and my view about the members is what I expressed at the beginning, which is that I think that yes, they are. Political junkies. They are kind of into it. They're not maybe not fully demographically representative of the population as a whole, but their basic instincts are sensible and rational, and they are committed. And I think that where the tension arises is that when a group, someone like me who didn't have a career in politics, with someone like David Cameron and George Osborne, who are seen as sort of very London and a sort of elitist, sort of capture a party, a bit like Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson and those guys captured the Labour Party. They say, look, we think that you've tried this experiment of losing, repeatedly by going for William or Ian Duncan Smith or Michael Howard. Why don't we try something new? Because it seems to us pretty obvious that unless we kind of are pragmatic and understand where the population is moving and adapt the party, that you're going to keep repeating the same thing, which is a sort of sign of insanity. And it's so I think that the tension, where those sentiments come from, is the tension between those two things.
Those who know about the BBC will be familiar with the phenomenon of amalisation.
I'm just trying to get a news story for Tortoise. I'm trying to create. He told a Tortoise.
As ever, you too kind. There's a lady who's been waiting, and then we'll have to find out.
Fiona Oliphant, audio journalist and producer. This conversation has heightened or made me reflect more on something I've been thinking about, which is labelling distracting us from looking at the issue? So we talk about rich, poor, young, old, Leave, Remain, Tory, Labour. And I think there's a deeper paradox, and it came to me when I was watching the leadership debate on the BBC the other night, how we are, as human beings, a lot more complex than this one thing or another. And what struck me was that as the politicians were pitching for their leadership, you could see they were saying what the listeners wanted to hear, and the listeners were wanting to hear what they heard. That at the same time does not mean that they wouldn't be, say, pro-climate change. And if I think of my mother, for example, she could vote one way but say, yes, we need to save the planet. So I would say that amongst the older generation, maybe this ties in with the house ownership issue, over 45, those with influence and power are voting one way, do have concerns about other things, but are not challenging some of the political ideas that are being put forward. 45 and under, possibly, and that's obviously not exclusive, I would suggest people are interrogating it more and they will find the holes in the arguments. So I'm wondering whether there is a way that, instead of thinking young and old, one can establish a dialogue, and whether, in fact, those who don't have the influence at the moment but are challenging the ideas, have got the intellectual energy, whether there is a way of their providing a bridge and opening a conversation which encourages those people who are voting one way, if you like. We all have consistencies. It's like Miriam Margolyes saying, yes, I put petrol in my car, but I support Mark Rylance for resigning from the RSC because BP is sponsoring it. So how do we, but then if you speak probably to somebody in their 20s, I'll speak to my niece or nephew, they'll say, with climate change, we're prepared not to buy this to support the planet. So there is, by and large, a greater integrity of position. So how can we bring that part of the population to, if you like, the prize of the Tory party in terms of voters? How can we bring those people into the conversation in a sufficiently forceful way to influence the dialogue and influence a more challenging conversation further up amongst the Tory grandees?
Thank you. Lastly, the flag of Agatha has been lifted. Therefore, it falls to me to try very hard, and I shall try, to synthesize something from this excellent discussion. The problem that was posed was, what's the future of the Conservative Party? And Rachel began by saying, well, you know, one of the key, if not the defining characteristics of the modern Conservative Party is it's not the Labour Party, and that may be good enough, or may have to be good enough. And also went on to say that as hard a rap as the members get, don't forget that their voting for the leadership is one of the few really, you know, active moments they get. Others felt strongly about deselection. Amal gave a very interesting analysis of why the party is so ill-placed and almost out of its time. It seems to be appealing to a world that just simply doesn't exist and has lost sight of the fact that the cultural identity is now as much of a definer, if not more so, than economic status, and that to borrow Andrew Breitbart's words, culture is now upstream from politics, a point that was also made by Anatole. Andrew asked us to sort of postulate the apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the theatre question, which was if you set Brexit aside, the party agrees on quite a lot, which may indeed prove to be true if we get beyond Brexit in my lifetime, which I increasingly think is unlikely. So I have three main takeaways, which is that it's quite clear that there are ideas and demands that to which the Conservative Party could respond. Charlotte made the point about the serious generational problem about property, that the property-only democracy years of the 80s simply have gone, and now there's a whole generation of people who cannot aspire to own a property before they're 40, which was not the case 30 years ago. Anne talked about the gap between those who talk about tax cuts and the people she works with and meets who are talking about basic provision of services and law and order and crumbling schools and the fact that county councils are falling to pieces, and that gap suggested a real cognitive dissonance in the Tory party. And Chris mentioned the opportunity that was, as is often forgotten, identified by Margaret Thatcher, of climate change, and the fact that the party might have to change its whole way of looking at things, because clearly a governmental response to climate change involves not turning away from regulation, but finding smart regulation. We also heard from Judith about the two reasons she joined the Conservative Party. One to meet boys is an excellent reason, and then the fascinating incident with the rally with Rory Stewart, and I think what this shows is that there has to be a messenger as well as a message, and which leads one to what James said about the Bannonite Conservative Party that's emerging, and whether or not, in fact, cephalogically, in terms of electoral maths, that might just be enough to get them over the line. A reality I think we have to acknowledge. And I conclude with what Amal said by way of warning, that the centrist elite, the liberal elite, the metropolitan elite, whatever pejorative term you want to think of it, whatever else it has done, has not come up with an alternative narrative. It is very good at spitting facts and evidence and data at populists, but it has yet to come up with a narrative or a story, although I'd urge you, if you can, to watch Kamala Harris from last night's hustings, who I think has just got the germ of an early narrative response to the Trumpian Bannonite offer. Very interesting and a fascinating way to start the day. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful time at this first Festival of ThinkIns. Thank you.